Here's another Bitcoin cheat sheet that is going to help you succeed in 2024 and 2025 when it comes to your Bitcoin investing, because these United States presidential elections tend to occur at a very interesting moment in the cycle. And this has been the case in each of the cycles here depicted in this chart. And we're going to be talking about how these elections impact price and when does Bitcoin tend to peak in its bull market relative to when these elections tend to occur. Subscribe to the channel for more cheat sheets and guides like this in the future, and like this video if you enjoy content like this going forward. So you can see that the positioning of these elections in the Bitcoin cycle, very curious, because these elections tend to occur around a period of not much going on. The so-called boring zone, not much going on, the reaccumulation phase, also around the halving event as well. We tend to see sideways price action, but these elections tend to proceed parabolic upside in the later stage of the Bitcoin bull market. And you can see that this has been the case in the 2016-2017 cycle, also 2020 and 2021, whereby after the elections we saw phenomenal upside into new all-time highs and beyond. And also the elections that lay ahead, also around November, going to likely proceed parabolic upside in the coming months. And this just ties in really nicely with this chart, which is also the playbook for you, because it's going to help you really capitalize on this market and the Bitcoin parabolic phase in the cycle. Because if we see in presidential elections around November or so, then we see parabolic upside time and again across the cycle. How do these elections tie in with a Bitcoin bull market later on? Well, it's interesting that around November, we then tend to peak a certain period of time after the halving, and that period is around 500 days after the halving. In each cycle also, you can just see that 2016, 518 days after the halving, we peak. 2020, 2021, 550 days after the halving, we peak. And if that were to be the case again in this cycle, we'd peak in September, October 2025. But the fantastic, interesting thing about this is that we tend to peak 1 year after a presidential election. And that's really interesting, because if we focus on the presidential election in 2020, November, roughly speaking, then we actually peaked in November 2021. What about in 2016, 2017, that November presidential election, we peaked in December 2017. So very close to approximately a year. A year after the elections, we tend to peak in the Bitcoin bull market. And that has been the case over the past 3 cycles. Past 2 cycles, in fact, but it could be the case also in this situation as well. And that's really interesting, because that's also what the halving principle is suggesting to us as well, whereby 500 days after the halving, we tend to peak, roughly speaking, and that aligns with a potential September, October, November area, which is going to be approximately a year after the elections. And what's interesting is that if we look at this chart here, the boring zone, this reaccumulation period after the halving, this reaccumulation period after the halving, across time, we tend to see the boring zone, just sideways price action occur. But during this period, we also see, or at least near the end of these periods, we tend to see elections take place. And then you see price really enter the banana zone. The banana zone being the parabolic phase in the cycle that occurs after the boring zone. And it's really interesting how presidential elections tend to occur slightly before this banana zone takes place. Just notice how we're not really doing much around the time of elections when it comes to Bitcoin's price action, and then we simply see Bitcoin's price action take off. Same thing in the 2020-2021 cycle, and we may be on the cusp of something similar as well. And history suggests that the boring zone simply precedes the banana zone going forward. And this is a great chart that just showcases how long after the halving we tend to consolidate in a reaccumulation period and a reaccumulation phase after the halving before we finally break out into the parabolic phase of the cycle. And actually we could do this across cycles. 161 days is usually that sort of time frame after the halving where we break out from the reaccumulation period. 161, 160 days or so after the halving is when we start to transition into that parabolic phase of the cycle. And you can see this quite clearly from the chart that I've been sharing since really March, April of this year, that this is time for a breakout for Bitcoin. It's time for it to transition into the parabolic phase of the cycle. The post-halving reaccumulation phase, the so-called boring zone, transitions into the banana zone, the post-halving parabolic upside phase, and this breakout tends to occur 160 days or so. This has been the case in 2020, and in 2016, it took 154 days after the halving to see price breakout from its reaccumulation phase. So we are on the cusp of a major transition away from the reaccumulation into finally that parabolic phase of the cycle. And this is a chart that I've been sharing for a long time, but I've recently found this in the internet, which really puts things into one chart here across cycles dating back to 2016. You've got the 2020 cycle, the 2024 cycle as well. You can see here that we're really in that breakout zone, in that proverbial sweet spot. And in fact, if you were to do what I did in my first chart there, you can see this sideways for a long time before we finally break out into the parabolic phase of the cycle. And this is something you can do also in this cycle here. Just have a look. And so we break out a little bit earlier than the 168 days proposed here. Just notice how this breakout is a little bit, there's a different alignment here in terms of when we break out exactly, because that reaccumulation range is essentially in line with the pre-halving top, and this is the reaccumulation range high. And so as a result, we consolidate below, in 2016, we consolidate below this reaccumulation range high for a little bit of time, and then we break out from there and then pull back to turn that reaccumulation range high into new support to confirm that parabolic upside. So here, this says that we break out 168 days after the halving, whereas this breakout occurs a little bit earlier than that 154 days actually, because then we have a lot of time. If we align this perfectly with the local top here in the pre-halving period, then you can see that we break out a little bit earlier at this moment. So a few days extra. And this is why I slightly disagree with this chart, but generally it is really just a handful of days that is the difference here. And so this is a fantastic chart to give you a summary of the reaccumulation phase after the halving, which then sees price transition into the parabolic phase of the cycle. And it's really interesting how this ties in with the election years being a valuable and pivotal part of ending the reaccumulation phase and enabling price into a parabolic phase of the cycle. You can see how the boring zone is always, there's a catalyst in the form of elections to end that boring zone. And it could be very well the case that this is going to occur once again to enable a bull market peak approximately a year later, as per this mirror principle when it comes to the halving, that we tend to see 500 days roughly after the halving a bull market peak and 500 days before the halving a bear market bottom. And you can do this for all cycles. It's roughly the same. That's the beauty of this halving mirror principle theory, which I like to go on. And so after the elections, a year or so, that's probably when we're going to see Bitcoin peak in its bull market. So the reaccumulation phase is on the cusp of ending and transitioning us finally into the parabolic phase of the cycle. And if you want to learn more, subscribe to the free Rekt Capital newsletter down below in the description for more level-headed insights, things, resources, tools that are going to help you succeed in 2024 and 2025 in your Bitcoin investing, as well as altcoin investing. So subscribe to this channel. Subscribe to the free newsletter in the description down below. Like this video if you enjoy content like this going forward. And I'm Rekt Capital, and I'll speak to you in the next one. Speak to you soon.